Yeah, I think I've got to say it's got to be some of the power clean variations,
Mhm.
um, because you can get so much out of them. You can train that sort of whole force velocity continuum. You can do light loads with things like jump shrugs and hang high pulls, maybe a moderate load there, through to high loads with power cleans, power snatches, those sorts of things. And then you can, if it's just a pulling variation, so whether it's a clean pull from the floor or a hang pull, you can go much heavier. And you can really challenge your movement patterns with them. You get a high load stimulus, but it's also very ballistic. So performing a range of those, because it gives you such variety. If it's just power clean variations, um, you can then get athletes of all natures performing them.
TeamBuilder is the online strength and conditioning software for performance coaches that allows you to create training programs and track progress over time for things like max back squat, jump height, or any other KPI that you collect. The free-form programming features allow you to brand and design your programs so athletes can complete them at their own pace or get extra rehab work in. The force plate and VBT integrations allow coaches to easily track KPIs that are critical for all sports. TeamBuilder Strength is currently offering a 30-day free trial when you sign up with the code EURO. Head to teambuilder.com and sign up with promo code EURO to access this exclusive offer. Welcome back to my podcast Science and Sports. I'm your host Simon, and today I'm joined by Paul Comfort. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Simon. Great to be invited on to the podcast. I'm looking forward to having a chat with you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. We talked a little bit beforehand. I got in contact with you via social media. I was thinking about going to the IUSCA Congress in Leeds a couple of months ago, where you had a really, really good speech on the podium. So I'm really happy to talk to you right now because I couldn't make it to Leeds the other day. Paul, where do I catch you at the moment?
You can find me on social media on either X or Instagram. It's Paul Comfort 1975, which gives away my age. Or you can find me on certainly my research on ResearchGate. I'm also on LinkedIn as well if anyone wants to contact me.
I don't want to take anything away. You're also a strength and conditioning coach, a sports scientist, and also a researcher and a lecturer in England, right? Can you tell
Yep,
me a little bit about your journey, a little bit about your background, how you got started, and so on?
yep, no problem. It's quite a long journey. So I started off working primarily as a personal trainer, going back over 30 years now, before strength and conditioning was established in the UK. So
Mm-hmm.
it had already been established with the National Strength and Conditioning Association in America, but there was nothing in the UK. So really, it was personal training when I started, and that was a combination of either working with athletes that wanted to get better or really wealthy, overweight businessmen that wanted to improve their health. That side was quite lucrative. There were a lot of those that wanted the personal training, but the far more interesting bit was working with the athletes to try and improve their performance. And that was even before things like rugby union was professional in the UK. So there were no strength coaches. The old football team, soccer team might have a fitness coach, and that was really to improve aerobic fitness. That was just go out and run 10K with them, and that would be it. So that's where I started, and then I was quite lucky. I did personal training qualifications, worked in a gym as a personal trainer, then decided to start university a little bit later. I think I was 20 when I started university. Studied sports science, then went on to do a master's in nutrition and exercise, all during which time I was still working as a personal trainer, and then ended up working in a series of different universities in lecturing roles. But I was really lucky that with each of my lecturing roles, I always had a bit of time aside to work with either university teams or partnerships that the universities had with local sports teams, which was great because it gave you a real insight. And that was before a lot of universities were really doing that. Fast forward to where I am now at the University of Salford, and I think I'm in about my 17th year here now. And when I started at the University of Salford, I had 3 mornings a week dedicated to working with some of the sports teams that we had partnerships with,
Hmm.
which includes professional rugby league and rugby union teams, Sale Sharks, Salford Red Devils, and then we've also got a lot of links with all the local football teams where I'm based near Manchester. Um, there's such a high density of professional sports teams and semi-professional teams. It gives us a really good insight into what they're doing, and really allows us to embed research in a real world environment, because we can use some of those teams for research purposes, or some of the coaching staff will ask us questions. And if there is no answer to that question, we can then work with them to try and use a research based approach to evaluate their practices, etc., and then try and develop the specific research there.
Hmm.
So I started off, like I said, personal training. As soon as the UK Strength and Conditioning Association was being formed, I became a founder member of that. At that point, I was already a certified strength and conditioning coach with the National Strength and Conditioning Association out in America. And then especially when I moved to Salford, like I said, about 17 years ago, that was when things, I suppose, grew a lot more. The UK Strength and Conditioning Association at that point would have been about 3 years old. So still really developing and in its infancy. And then I suppose that's what I transitioned more from doing more strength and conditioning work alongside my job as a lecturer, into doing much more research, still doing some strength and conditioning work. Whereas now I'm at the point there that I love to still go out and work with athletes, but I rarely get the time to be able to
Hmm.
do that, with being a professor at the University of Salford and overseeing all the research that we do at the university, linking in with some of the partnerships with the different sports teams. Actually being able to do a lot of that data collection and work with athletes myself is now somewhat limited, which is a shame. But it's been a real transition from much more hands-on, slowly transitioning to evaluating what we were doing in a strength and conditioning or sports science context using a research-based approach, to now sort of being really at the end where the majority of my time is research or coordinating research with
Hmm.
colleagues and friends and people at local sports teams to really try and answer some of the key questions that we need to answer in a real world environment with real athletes. It's no good just testing university students all the time, because they'll adapt to anything, because in the UK, most university students aren't particularly well trained.
Yeah. A question before I want to go a little bit more in depth about your work as a researcher and the strength and conditioning part about it. Did you have any mentors or some external influences that like not changed your career but set like a path towards it? Like where you at the moment now?
It's a really interesting question, actually, because certainly for the strength and conditioning side of things, as I said, when I first started off, there was nothing in the UK. There was no UK Strength and Conditioning Association, so it was really a case of find as much research as you possibly could, find any of the good textbooks, so things like Super Training by Mel Siff, and any of those types of textbooks, which was really just, there was science within it, but it was really, this is what people did 50 years ago. Um, so when I first started, it was just try and get hold of any information you could, and try and develop where you could. When it came to more the research side of things, it was then a case of, when I started at the University of Salford, I suppose the first person to really push me in the right direction with a lot of stuff that I've been doing is Dr. Phil Graham-Smith, who is now based at Manchester Metropolitan University. He employed me at the university, and we used to sit down and have some fantastic discussions over research. He was working a lot with UK athletics, had a huge amount of experience, a fantastic applied biomechanist. And that's probably the first maybe 6 years of my career at Salford. Then
Hmm.
he moved on and went out to the Middle East, was working for a while, and has recently come back to the UK. But from the research side of things, that he was probably the first person to really push me in the right direction, and and I suppose to mentor me and guide me at those very early stages of when my research career was taking off. I've been really lucky because I think I must have been now at least the last 15 years, if not longer, to the National Strength and Conditioning Association conference in America, and made some very good friends there. I would class most of them as friends now rather than just colleagues. So lots of work with people like Professor Greg Huff, Professor Mike Stone, some of the names that most of your listeners will have heard of that always attend those conferences. And the nice thing is, the first few times you attend the conferences and you see people that you've read their research since you were doing your undergraduate degree yourself, and then you meet them, and at first it's a bit strange and intimidating, but actually as soon as you get to know them, they're all really nice people. They want to help, they want to collaborate, they're there for you to reach out to. Much easier now with the different options, whether it's through social media or whether it's through Zoom, Teams, whatever whatever you might use, to then stay in contact with those people. So that's sort of ongoing with people like that. You can reach out to those people that have got decades worth of experience, and pick their brains about things and ask questions. Sometimes you think might be silly, but sometimes it's you get some great insight from those individuals. But as I said, the strength and conditioning side of things in the UK, there was nothing really around when I first started doing the personal training side of things for anyone to be a mentor at that stage. So it was really much a lot of trial and error at the early stages.
Mm-hmm. How was it when you transitioned more into the role as a researcher and a professor? When you did your first or second or third own research paper, how was it for you to make that switch more towards the researching part in the university? And is there any, like, do you have any favorite research you did in the past, or an ongoing study that you could share that you're
Yeah.
really interested in?
I suppose the transition, as I said, Phil Graham Smith was the one person I really sort of just went to and said, right, okay, this is what I'm thinking of doing. This is the approach I'm planning on using. What do you think? Do you think it's a viable study? Do we need to do anything differently? Let's get ethics approval. And actually, the first few studies we did looking at some of the different weightlifting variations was inspired by questions from a few students who had said, well, if we know that the second pull phase of a clean generates the highest power output, the highest force, the highest rate of force development, why do we do all the other phases? Why do we start at the floor if we're not a weightlifter, if we're not competing in weightlifting?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a case of, well, no idea. There's no research out there to tell us. But while you achieve the highest force, power rate of force development during the second pull phase of a clean, all of that research was when you'd started at the floor. So you've already gained momentum. You've already technically unweighted the bar. There's already that momentum on the way up. So whether that would be the same when you start from the knee, or you do it as a hang variation where you hinge to the knee, or from mid thigh, we didn't know. So that's where we started some of the research, and that's great because actually I still get now students that will stick their hands up in a session and ask a question, and you go, I don't know. Let me go and have a look, see if the research is out there. If it's not, let's see if we can answer those questions. And you get the same from practitioners. We'll go in and we'll have discussions with the different sports teams that we've got partnerships with, or where now, because our master's program has been running for over 15 years in the local area, we've got so many people in different sports teams that have done our master's program. Some have done PhDs with us that still come back and ask questions, and that gives us some great ideas for research. So it's really nice that some of those early bits of research on the the power clean variations and their effects on performance has gone right the way through to me being invited probably 3 years ago now to write the National Strength and Conditioning Association's position statement on weightlifting for sports performance, which I coordinated. I didn't write the whole thing myself. There's probably 10 plus authors on there, all with either a combination of lots of research experience, lots of coaching, or extensive coaching and a little bit of research. So to see that journey going through has been fantastic, and to be able to be invited to write something like the NSCA's position statement on weightlifting for sports performance and work with some of those people that have inspired me to research this area has been fantastic. So while it's not an empirical bit of research, that position statement is probably the one of the things that I'm most proud of, because it is that culmination of probably 15 years worth of research that I've done, but plus collaborations with a lot of those people over that time, but also going right back to some of the research that was done in the 1970s and 80s, but a lot of more anecdotal stuff from some of the weightlifting manuals from 1950s onwards, which have been really insightful. And the things that people used to do have now been shown by research to be really effective. Simple things like the use of cluster sets. So do 2 repetitions, have a short rest, then another 2, short rest, then another 2, rather than just doing 6 repetitions straight. So it's really interesting to get into that level of detail and work with people like Professor Kyle Pierce, Professor Mike Stone, Greg Half, Greg Half's wife, Erin Half, who's a fantastic weightlifting coach as well. And to learn from those people that have got a lot more experience in some of those areas. So I suppose in terms of, for people wanting to get into research, surround yourself with good people. Now, good people, have a look at their research, see what's robust, see what's really good. It's not necessarily the person that's published the most. Have a look at the science. How strong is the science within there? How much does it stick to the basic principles that you should be following? But yeah, surround yourself by good people and learn from them, and you'll continue to learn. I'm really lucky at the moment. At any one point in time, I've probably got 10 PhD students doing their doctorates. And I always say to them that certainly by 18 months to 2 years into it, I should be learning from them, because they're spending all of their time focused purely on that topic. I can't stay up to date with some of that research like they do. So they should be teaching me. And if they are, I'm doing a good job.
Yeah. And I also had it just to add on the topic you scratched with the learning part. I had a lot of guys on from different sports, different roles in a sport team, for example. And I think it doesn't matter if he's in a better league or a better team than you are, or even just a semi-professional team. You can learn from anyone. And like you said, if you surround yourself with people who are interested and willing to learn and to open their mind for new ideas, I think that's one of the best things you can do.
Definitely. And I think, to that point, in terms of, it doesn't matter what level of athlete you're working with, or, what level of competition you're working within. If you're at the highest level, you've got so many resources. You don't have to be creative or innovative. If you're working at slightly lower levels where you're stretched with resources, whether that's people or whether that's equipment, etc., you suddenly have to be far more creative. So you can learn so much from some of those people, as well as the people at that elite level. But you can learn across the board, which is brilliant. And you've just got to be open-minded to that and suddenly think, well, why has that question been asked? Why is somebody using that approach? Is it better? Maybe I should do that. It might be more efficient.
Mm-hmm. When I want to go back a little bit to your research you did and you're also part of, for example, it doesn't need to be one of, let's say, your research topics, but I'm interested in, for example, you're part of a sports team and your coach is open for new ideas and he's open for bringing things into the training routine, let's say for strength and conditioning, or in my case on the ice, to try out something new or to try out something different. How can then, for example, how can coaches use different research papers to their advantage and apply it to a real life setting, if that makes sense?
Yep, no, it does completely. Well, I think the key thing to do is try and find the research which has been conducted in an applied setting, because then it's much easier for you to apply. It may, it could be ice hockey you want to apply it in, and it could have been
Hmm.
done in soccer, but it's still an applied team sport environment. So can some of those basic principles be drawn across rather than something that's very, very laboratory based? Everything's controlled as much as possible, and you find huge improvements in certain physical characteristics.
Hmm.
But anyone listening to this podcast who is a practitioner and works in a real world environment will know there's so many things you'd like to be able to control, but you can't. It's not possible. So it's much better to look at the more applied research done in those applied settings and then be able to apply that to different sporting environments, whether that's enhancing power development, improving change of direction, performance, whatever that might be. Now you can then start to look and say, well, okay, at those more laboratory based studies, which are more controlled, and as you go, even down to looking at things at individual cells, which goes far away from what we're looking at within sport. But then, how much extra information can we get from those more laboratory based studies to inform and refine what we're doing at that more applied level?
Hmm.
And I think the way I look at things is we should do most of the research in an applied setting. If we find that we're getting improvements and adaptations, then let's try and do the more controlled laboratory work to say why. Then we can find, if we can find out why things are improving to a certain magnitude, can we do something differently? Can we improve that even further? Because if you start at the cellular level and try and work from there back to your whole body and team sport environments, most of that's things that we did at a cellular level no longer work. So first of all, start off looking at much more applied research and stick with the really basic principles. What are those? If you're wanting the coach to buy into it and understand things and see how it can improve performance, what are the key predictors or the key factors or physical characteristics which will enhance performance in your sport? Is it strength or power? Is it aerobic capacity? What's the limiting factor in that sport? So if you look at some sports, like if you look at soccer, pretty much everyone is aerobically fit. They do so much pitch-based training, technical and tactical training. Fitness aerobically is very good and stays high throughout the season. Strength levels, pretty poor generally. Could easily be improved substantially from the extensive amount of data we've collected. If we flip that around though, and we look at something like rugby union, in rugby union, they're all strong, they're all explosive. Is their aerobic capacity high enough? Could we improve their ability to perform repeated high intensity activities in those worst case scenarios by improving aerobic capacity? And if we then can we learn more from what's done in soccer to improve aerobic capacity? And can soccer learn more from what's done in rugby or other sporting
Hmm.
codes to improve the strength and the power side of things? So I think that's where to start, is look at where is their proof of concept. It may be a different sport, but then can we use that and apply that very context and environment specific to then start enhancing performance?
Hmm. That's interesting that you say that, because when I did my bachelor's and master's thesis, I conducted an experiment about if there is any correlations between different off-ice testing metrics that I chose with an on-ice sprint or on-ice testings, for example. And I also quoted different team sports, as for example soccer and football and everything that I could find, obviously on the internet, including one of your studies as well. So thank you again for that help.
No problem.
I wanted to keep that for the end as a surprise, but it's out now. It helped me a lot. Also, the one you conducted there. When we turn it around, I just asked you about how we can identify a good study or how we can maybe use it when we have the opportunity and have a team who's interested in changing something. When we, like you said, the quote, flip the switch on to the other side, how do any newcomers in the researching area? For example, me, I did my master's thesis, but I never published anything because I find it very difficult to get a starting point on how to actually find something which is interesting, how to publish it, and the whole procedure about the start of writing a manuscript or a paper to the end of it. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? This podcast is presented by Like Me, your partner for social media and online marketing from Weiden, and Praxis im Salzhaus, your contact for physiotherapy and health in Altenstadt.
Yeah, definitely. So I suppose one of the key things to do is in terms of trying to publish, find a bit of a niche, find an area where it's under researched or where it's just not been researched well. And you'll find a few of those, but find an area which is a bit of a niche. And that could be the sport itself, or it could be certain aspects of a sport. It could be certain training methods. As I said, I started looking at the different weightlifting variations because all of the research was on weightlifters. There was very little on the use of different variations of weightlifting derivatives in a sporting population or in sporting context. And if there was, everything they were using and implementing had been taken from what weightlifters do. But none of us train like weightlifters. Their technical, tactical training, etc., that's all weightlifting. Whereas the majority of other sports, the technical and tactical training takes up the majority of their training time. So first of all, find an area that you're really passionate about and where there is a niche where it's more likely to be published. And then have a look at what are the limitations of the research in that area. And you've really got to start to understand some of the testing methods that people have used. And then for you to publish, you need to know what the requirements are for the journals. So any journal website you go on will have guidelines for authors or instructions for authors. And that will clearly state that certain things must have been done within that study. So if you look at something like the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, in there you have to have established test-retest reliability for your variables. So you need to make sure then you either have between session reliability, so you've tested at 2 time points. Not always possible in an applied sporting context. You turn around to the coach and say, I want to do all my testing on Monday.
Yeah.
I want them not to train on the Thursday and I want to test again on Friday. They might say no. So then the minimum is within session reliability. So you can't do that with a 1 repetition maximum. You wouldn't test them multiple times in a day. But if you're doing sprints, jumps, isometric strength testing, you could do 3 or 5 trials of that test and then determine your reliability. The other thing then that the journal requires is statistical power, or ideally an a priori sample size calculation. And what that means is prior to starting the study, you conduct a statistical power calculation to identify what's the minimum sample size you need to demonstrate a real or meaningful change, difference, association, whatever your question is. And you have to then look at all of the other research that's been published and say, well, what's the magnitude of change or the strength of the correlation I'm expecting to find? So you almost need to have done your introduction or your literature searching first to be able to say, this is the norm. This is what normally happens. And within this population, I'm expecting to find a change over time or a correlation of this strength. Then you can calculate the minimum number of athletes you need. Once you've done that, great, you've hit those sort of minimum thresholds that they insist upon. Obviously, you have to get ethics approval as well, and you have to make sure your athletes all consent to not just conducting the testing, but that the testing data can be used for research purposes. And that's interesting in an applied environment because the athletes all have to do the testing. Most of them are contractually obliged to do the testing, or it's just part of being on the team. So you're getting them to consent not to do different testing necessarily, but just to their data being used for research purposes, especially if it's an observational study and you're just saying, how well does this work in this environment? So that's one place then to look at in terms of where would I like to publish? What are the minimum requirements that I need to tick those boxes so that it would even be considered for publication? And then as much as you can, read loads of articles from that journal, get an idea for how it's structured, how it's written, the language used, and try and replicate that process. And it really is a bit like following a recipe for baking a cake or something. And once you can follow that recipe well, doesn't mean it will get published, but it's probably going to get considered and reviewed, and then you'll get feedback from the reviewers.
Would you say it's more beneficial for an individual to publish, if he wants to publish like one really good researched, good evaluated paper where he really put like 100% effort in it, and where he really wants to see a change, or which has practical use, or to publish more and more and more just to have like more studies out? Because I think a lot of times there are some people that just wants to have a lot of volume of publications out.
Yeah, no, that is a very very interesting question. Certainly earlier on in people's careers, there is a pressure to publish more
Hmm.
because that way your name gets known, you develop a research profile, you get invited to present at conferences, etc. But you still need the quality there. It still needs to be scientifically robust. So it shouldn't be about trying to publish as much as you can as fast as you can. Although there definitely is a pressure to do that. Some universities, there's a lot more pressure. In some countries, there's definitely more pressure. For you to get promotion in certain institutions in certain countries, you have to publish an extensive amount of research. So there's huge pressure for that sometimes. But we're performing science, so you should be doing it to the best of your ability. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. And this is something I have to tell my PhD students. It's never going to be perfect. I can read through it and go, brilliant. I think that's great. Submit it for publication. Any other of our collaborators can think that. We submit it, and the reviewers will come back, or the editor will come back with a whole list of comments that they think we should address. Some of them are very, very useful and very insightful, where you go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Brilliant. Let's add this into it. Let's explain stuff differently. Or that gives me an idea for another study. So it's never going to be perfect. And you can also look back at research you've published 5 or 10 years ago and think, oh, I could have done that so much better. Now, that should be seen as a good thing. Because what that means, if I can look back at something I published 5 years ago and think, I could have done that better, I've learned, I've developed, I've become better at performing and undertaking research. So that should never be perceived as a bad thing. But we need to make sure when we publish that there is we've done our due diligence, we've read enough of the research, we understand the methods, and that the data is as robust as possible. And as much as we can, what we should be trying to do is try our best to disprove the hypotheses. Because if you do your best to disprove it, and then you find that you've still got a positive finding, that's more likely to stand up over the course of the next few decades worth of people doing similar research.
Hmm. I have one question that very interests me in. I also got notified by a friend of mine who I studied with. He shared some thoughts about research and about scientific papers and about his like graduation paper. And it's more like probably like a question for you kind of, but we talked a little bit about that, and he thought about the possibility of putting his graduation paper, his master's thesis, as a publication to make it online available to everyone to see. Do you think that, in not especially in this case, but in general, is a good idea to do if you got a good score on your, let's say, master's thesis, for example, or to really leave it on the table at the university and focus on creating something new if you really want to publicate something?
So I think making the research that's been conducted as part of any university level study open for the public to view is a great way of doing things. But we need a certain amount of robustness within that.
Hmm.
And that varies across the subject areas. It varies across the supervisors that you might have and the level of understanding and knowledge of that supervisor on that specific topic you're working on. And quite a few universities, certainly at postgraduate level, will have a repository where all of those resources are available anyway. Just most people aren't aware that you can go onto the university library repository and find. Certainly all PhD theses will be on there, unless they've got an embargo because they're linked to industry
Hmm.
or to elite sport. The best approach, which is what we try and do with our students, is encourage them to publish and from the start, from the point they submit their proposal, is say, right, if your data collection is good enough, even if you only scrape a passing grade, if the data is good enough, it's publishable.
Mm-hmm.
Your write-up might not be good enough, which is why your grade might be lower. But what we want is somebody that can really collect some very robust and scientifically sound data, and then try and convert that to a publication. And I've been lucky. I've probably had, I would say, at least 20 publications from undergraduate students from the data they've collected as part of their undergraduate degree. And I always say to them, you can publish this. I will help you get to the point that it's published. So some of them are then the first author. Some will say at the end of their degree, I've had enough. I hated the process of doing my dissertation. It was too much work. I don't want to see it again, but I don't mind reading through the proofs if I want to write it. So then sometimes I'm the lead author. We've probably had a similar number of people with their master's degrees that have then published. So I will actively encourage those that have some good data where they've ticked those boxes that I mentioned. They've got the test retest reliability. They've calculated the minimum sample size they need. They've used the best methods they possibly can. And I'll encourage them to try and publish that. And that's great because then it's not just being reviewed by myself and maybe somebody else who's marked it. It's been through that full peer review process to make it as robust as we can. Now, the peer review process has flaws within it, obviously, but if they can publish it in a scientific journal, it will have been strengthened from going through that process. So the one thing to do is try and encourage people as much as possible with any thesis that they write during their university level education is see if you can get it published. Speak to your academic supervisor or advisor and see if you can work with them to try and get it published. And they should be able to give you the guidance. And that's great for them. To be able to turn around and say, oh, last year I supervised 10 students and 4 of them got their work published is fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Paul, before I come to my last segment and the rapid fire questions, I have one more question that is really interesting to me right now, because we're talking about a lot of researching papers, a lot of publications, the process about it. Do you think it's mandatory to have multiple authors on a study you conduct, or do you think it's still a good paper if it's only done by you, as by one person? Because you always see like 10, 15, 20 guys writing one paper or a couple of times, but you rarely see like really a single individual doing a paper.
Yeah, I think it really does depend on the paper. I've published a couple of things where it's just me. It's much better and easier to work as part of a team. You do get some strange papers where you see 40 or 50 authors. I'm always question how much all of those 40 or 50 people really contributed to that paper, but they should be appropriately contributing. But it's definitely more efficient and effective to have a group of people working together, and to make sure that what you have to do is make sure they've all read the manuscript. They've all proofed it. They've all given feedback and guidance on it. You can check and challenge each other's opinions and their interpretation of the research, and that tends to strengthen it. And that the majority of the time, there will definitely be a few authors. And it probably is a minority where it is just one person authoring alone. Because as I said, it's always useful to have somebody else that will advise you or guide you or critique you even throughout that process. From the point that you conceive the idea of the study, get somebody else to have a look at it and give you feedback. See if they'll assist with data collection. Makes the data collection much easier for you. See if they'll assist with the data analysis, the statistical analysis, and the write-up. So both approaches works. The odd one that, as I mentioned, though, is that when you see 40 or 50 people and think, well, okay, you've got more authors than you have participants. Is that appropriate? Or, is everyone in your laboratory putting their name on a paper to get another publication?
Okay, got it. Yeah. So nothing wrong with being a solo publication.
No, you just wouldn't expect it to be on, the majority of somebody's publications.
Yeah. Okay. Like I just mentioned, I have a couple of questions. I called it like a rapid fire, quick fire question round.
Yep.
So short answers are Yeah, good.
Yep.
No, I don't know how to phrase that, to be honest, but they're not hard questions. One of which being, if there's one book or one paper that everyone in a sports science world or strength and conditioning world should read, what's your favorite?
I think it's probably going back to something like Melsif super training and
Hmm.
looking at the science that was reported within there, and not from experiments though, but actually just from this is what we do, this is the applied setting. And now thinking about that in relation to the research which has been published and most of the theories and concepts within that book and similar books that were published around that time actually hold up with the scientific rigor. And maybe they've been tweaked and improved slightly from that science, but going back to some of the older stuff is really worthwhile. So for a book, something like Mel Sif Super Training, for publications in terms of research, go back to some of A.V. Hill's work in the 1930s and 1940s on force velocity characteristics of muscle. And then if
Okay.
people read that, they'll realize why most of the stuff on force velocity profiling and velocity based training is fundamentally flawed. Um, and that will allow you to critique how people have applied things from individual muscle fibers being stimulated, etc., to whole body. It doesn't always work. But if you haven't read that really old research, you wouldn't be aware. So always go back to some of the older research and see if it still holds up now, which most of it does.
Okay, that's interesting. I will check that out for sure. What is your favorite exercise that you do when you go to the gym, and your favorite exercise you had your athletes do when they had to go to the gym in a sport of your choice?
Yeah, I think I've got to say it's got to be some of the power clean variations,
Hmm.
um, because you can get so much out of them. You can train that sort of whole force velocity continuum. You can do light loads with things like jump shrugs and hang high pulls, maybe a moderate load there, through to high loads with power cleans, power snatches, those sorts of things. And then you can, if it's just a pulling variation, so whether it's a clean pull from the floor or a hang pull, you can go much heavier. And you can really challenge your movement patterns with them. You get a high load stimulus, but it's also very ballistic. So performing a range of those, because it gives you such variety. If it's just power clean variations, um, you can then get athletes of all natures performing them. So you said pick a sport of your choice. If I'm thinking about rugby league or rugby union, if somebody's had a lot of ankle injuries and they can't start at the floor, we can put the bar on blocks and start at the knees. If they've had a shoulder or wrist injury and they can't get into that front rack position to catch, you can just do a pulling variation and eliminate the catch. So it's so versatile with that the range of different exercises that we can do there. But you can really move with ballistic intent.
Hmm. That's interesting because we did it the same drill you just mentioned, the clean pull variant, mostly every day kind of in my team, because it's just for, especially for hockey, a full body explosive power drill where you can really adapt. We had a guy with a wrist injury, can just do the pulls.
Yep.
Like you said, love this drill as well. Paul, last question. What is, if you have something in mind, a big myth in the strength and conditioning or sports scientific world? What people still believe in and not maybe researching more about it so they believe it.
Yeah, I suppose one of the biggest things that I see when it comes more from technical coaches and still some strength coaches is looking at things like movement specificity and trying to mimic a movement in the gym that you would perform in your sport. It doesn't work. You can't mimic it. And if performing that sporting action made you better, you'd only have to ever play your sport and never set foot in the gym. You think about it for whatever exercise it might be. If you add load to it, suddenly the velocity is not specific,
Mhm.
and the ground contact times, the total movement time is no longer specific. But then if we do something where it's got that same velocity, can we still apply the same magnitude of forces that we might want? So I think movement specificity is part of the problem. We get that with most sporting drills that we perform. And what we really need to think about is the specific adaptations to the imposed demands. So how are we trying to make a muscle, tendon, whatever structure it is, how are we trying to make that adapt? How are you trying to make the heart adapt? How are you trying to make individual muscle fibers adapt? And make sure that we're training an individual in a way that will stimulate those adaptations rather than thinking about movement specificity too much.
Yeah, that's a good end quote right there, I think. It's a really interesting and well thought answer to that.
Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much for joining me today on my little show. I would love to tag some of your, or put some of your studies you conducted in the description down below so people can check it out. Like I said, I also quoted you in my thesis, so I will also put the one I quoted in the description below.
Brilliant.
And thank you very much for your insights on the scientific part of it. I had a lot of guests on the strength and conditioning world. Now the view from a researcher, a professor, a lecturer, again on basically the same topic, sports science, was very interesting for me. I hope also for my audience. And Paul, like I said, thank you very much. I wish you all the best.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
I hope you might talk again in the future.
Definitely. Just let me know if you want to have another chat at some point in the future on any specific topics.
100% I will. Paul, thank you very much and take care.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the podcast, leave a rating or comment, and share it with someone who loves sports science. And for more content, follow me on Instagram at science_in_sports_. See you in the next episode.